Hey, well, happy Wednesday, everyone. I hope you're doing well. When we started this whole biblical survey, we were in the middle of quarantine, lockdown, pandemic time, and it seems like that's just continuing. So, been praying for you this week. I hope you're doing well. I think more than ever, this is a time where God's people, we need to keep our eyes on Christ. There's a lot of difficulty, a lot of situations going on, and our eyes on Christ are so important. There's so many other voices that we could listen to and that could influence us. But the thing we want to be influenced more than anything is God. And that's why you're here. That's why you're listening to this. So we're going to go ahead and get right into it. I'm going to do a prayer on the beginning, and I just feel like we need it tonight. So let's do a quick prayer. God, we just want to ask you that you would have your way throughout this study, that you would be glorified, that you would reveal your word to us in new ways, that you would speak to us, that your Holy Spirit, God, would show us things that we need to learn, that we need to know, and maybe things that we need to repent of and change so that we can be more useful for you and not caught up in listening to the voices of this world and caught up in just the distraction the world is throwing our way. It's in your name that we pray. Amen. Amen. All right. So we're doing the book of Judges today, and this is a book to me that is, I don't know, I'm very conflicted about it, to be honest. When I was a young kid reading the Bible, I enjoyed like the judges rising up and doing these crazy, amazing military feats and defeating hundreds and thousands of people at a time, and I thought it was really cool. And then as I got older, there were more and more stories in there that really, I mean, disturbed is really the word that comes to mind. There are stories in Judges that are just so disturbing to me, and when you read them, they're disturbing, and when you dig into them, they're even more disturbing. And there's a theme that is happening throughout Judges, and we're gonna get to that in a little bit. But Judges is a challenging book for me to read and get into, but I think it's an important book. It's important to understand the story of how God has been redeeming His people. One of the things that it kind of reminds me of is back when I was a young kid, I was really close friends with two other guys. And so there were three of us, right? And between the three of us, I was sort of, I guess I'd say I was like the good kid. I was the best, just like the most moral and good. And then there was like friend number one he was kind of edgy and he was kind of, maybe not the best kid, but he was still pretty good. And then there was the last guy who was kind of borderline fringe good, but he was definitely way more on the outskirts of like following God and doing that. And I remember one day I was hanging out with my friend number one, who was the other kind of good kid, but kind of not so good. And we were in a grocery store, and there was a book that we were reading, or a magazine we were reading, and he's like, "Hey, watch this." And he just slipped it into his backpack and zipped it up and walked out. And I remember like walking out of the store, and I seriously was walking kind of like a robot, like, what is happening here? And I remember sweating and my throat got dry. And I remember walking out through the doors, and I'm following him, and I'm just like in this frozen panic. And I'm fully expecting he's gonna walk past the door, and he's gonna get tackled by like three plainclothes detectives that totally lock him up, and I'm gonna be locked up. And I just like, oh. And afterwards, I was like, oh man, like we just got a book and or like this magazine, it's like $8, and I don't have that much money, so okay. And so this happened again with him, and so I remember thinking, oh, well, that's a lot easier than buying stuff myself. And so I remember, and you'll notice this about when we do things that we are wrong, we always try to get other people to join us with it. It makes us feel better if other people are in on it with us. And so I went to my friend who was like the least Christian, the least good kid, right? And I remember showing him like, hey, I'm going to grab this book. And I remember it was like a Star Wars novel. Crazy. Anyhow, but I remember like, hey, and I put it in my backpack, and he said, what are you doing? No way, dude. No, like I'm not going to be involved in that. And he walked out of the grocery store as I'm like kind of zipping up my backpack thinking, oh my gosh. And it hit me. It hit me that here I was, the good kid, and I'm being taught a lesson by someone who's not a great person because I was just corrupted by someone I was hanging out around. The people that we choose to be around us have a massive influence on who we are, the choices that we make. And it's just incredibly important about who we spend time around. Bad company corrupts good morals, is I guess what the moral of the story is. And here I was being taught a lesson in morality by the bad kid, and it was really humbling to me. And when we come to the book of Judges, what we see is God has given His people warning after warning after warning. Do not you're going to go into your own land, but don't be around. Don't let other people live around you that are evil, that are idolatrous, that are wicked. because they're going to mess you up. And in Judges, you start to see some of the impact of that. So before we jump into Judges, I want to just go ahead and talk through. We're doing a biblical survey, which means it's the wide lens, it's the kind of the big story approach to looking at a book. We're going to do the whole book in one day and in one session. And so we're not going to go super fine minutia details. We're just going to hit on the main points so we can understand a picture of what God is doing. So what we see is this is the seventh book of the Bible. The first 5 books of the Bible, we call them the Pentateuch. It talks about God creating absolutely everything, and it's perfect, and his presence is with his people, and he talks to them, and he meets with them face to face, and he gives them one command. And then mankind, instead of following what God says and living in right relationship with him, the source of life, mankind sins and rebels against God. And because of that, sin is introduced into the world, wickedness is introduced in the world, and death then comes in the world, and God's presence is separated from people. And ever since that point, God has been working to make his people come back into a relationship with him, to not be separated or excluded, but to have a way to come back to life in him. What we see is in Genesis, there's an important promise. It's a covenant, and a covenant's a contractual agreement between 2 parties. And in this case, it's God and Abraham. And he promises Abraham 3 things in the covenant. He says, I will go ahead and bring you to a land of your own. I will give you descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky or as the sand on the seashore, and I will bless the entire world through you. So Abraham goes on to have all these descendants. They come down eventually to Egypt. God rescues them out of Egypt through his deliverer and leader Moses, who he leads them with miracles and signs of God's power and strength. And all of God's people are following in this covenant agreement that God made with Abraham. And as Abraham's descendants, they're heading towards going into the promised land. But before they go there, they disobey God, they complain, they rebel against him over and over and over again. And they finally get to the edge of the promised land. And instead of saying, God, we trust you, you're an amazing, powerful God, they freak out and they give up. And they're like, no, we're not going to go in there. We're too scared. And so God says that entire generation, you're going to wander in the desert until you all die out. And then the next generation will have a chance to go in. The only 2 that would still live to see the promised land were Joshua and Caleb, the only 2 people that were in that generation that said, yeah, God is so good. He's going to lead us to this. So finally, God gives them like the law, commandments, his covenant, and says, hey, I will give you these things in the covenant, but you need to obey me, follow my commandments, and then you will have life, and you will live long in the land. And so it came up to Joshua. The next generation came up, and under Joshua's leadership, they got led in military conquest and took over the land. But there wasn't the removal of everybody. They had more work to be done. So now Joshua has died out, and we're coming into Judges. So if you have your Bible with you, definitely open up to Judges, and we're going to be flipping through and reading some parts here and there so we can go ahead and see what is happening in the story of Judges, what's going on with God's people, what is going on with God, and how is it playing out. So right before we start with Judges, I want to bring up a couple of points before we go into the breakdown. So the first is when you hear the word judges, a judge is not a judicial judge like what we think of with the gavel and in court. A judge is actually a military leader or a clan chiefsman. And they were people that God would use to deliver Israelites when they were conquered by and oppressed by foreign armies, foreign people. Even though the judges would lead the people, it wasn't like Moses or Joshua where you had one leader and all Israel recognized him. A lot of times was a lot more fractured. Sometimes they would rise up and lead the people in battle, but they weren't really like a leader talking about all of the religious observations, and they weren't always seen by all the clans, and sometimes the different tribes were divided. So it's more of a military leader that came up. Here's another really important thing to catch in Judges. Once we get to the main bulk of Judges, there is a cycle that repeats itself over and over and over again. And here's what the cycle is. It starts off by Israel sins, by falling into idolatry and ignoring God and living a life of disobedience. Because they disobey God, God withdraws his protection, and they become conquered by a foreign power or army who brutally will oppress them. Once that this oppression gets really horrible, the Israelites will then cry out to God, hey, help us, God, this is horrible. We hate this. God then will raise up a judge to bring deliverance and liberation to his people, and there will be peace, usually until the judge will die, and then the people fall back into that cycle, and it repeats over and over and over. So here's the picture. We got judges. We have all of God's people now have been given the promised land. They've come into it under Joshua's leadership, and now they have to drive out some of the remnants of the land. So if you pull up, we're going to pull up now the slide that talks about the divisions and judges. So if you look in this, I feel like this breakdown is actually super helpful and super good. And what we can see at the top is there's two major divisions of the book of Judges. And the reason I think it's really great is because the first one is only 2 chapters. It basically sets up why is it that the people of Israel are going to have issues. And then what you'll see is that whole cycle going on here. There's different cycles. I'm going to focus on 6 of the judges. There's several other judges that are there for incredibly short. Like some of them are 1 verse or 2 or 3 verses. And then finally at the end, there's 2 major stories that talk through what is the state of Israel at the very close of the book. Okay, so as we look here at the very first section, what we can see about the people of Israel is that they had several victories in the very beginning of Judges, but they don't fully remove the Canaanites. In chapter 1, verse 19-21, they have victory, but they don't fully remove the inhabitants of the land. In 27-36, another victory, they don't fully remove the inhabitants of the land. And remember, God had commanded them, get rid of all the inhabitants of the land because they are intensely wicked. Child sacrifice, gross sexual immorality, just horrible, horrible wicked and wretchedness and idolatry. And so in Judges chapter 2, verses 1-5, an angel of the Lord comes to them. And here's what it says. The angel of the Lord went up from Gilgal to Bochim and said, I brought you up out of Egypt and led you into the land that I swore to give to your forefathers. I said, I will never break my covenant with you, and you shall not make a covenant with the people of this land, but you shall break down their altars. Yet you have disobeyed me. Why have you done this? Now therefore I tell you that I will not drive them out before you. They will be thorns in your sides, and their gods will be a snare to you. When the angel of the Lord had spoken these things to all the Israelites, the people wept aloud, and they called that place Bochim, which means weepers. There they offered sacrifices to the Lord. So what God tells them is, you did not keep up your side of the covenant, and because of that, the inhabitants of the land and their idol worship is going to be a snare to you. It's going to be a problem to you. It's going to influence you, and it's not in a good way. It's going to cause problems for you because you didn't obey the words God has given. Please remember this about God. Please remember this about God. When we're children, we'll hear from our parents, don't do this, don't do this, don't do this. Most of us understand what that's like. And with the understanding of a child, we usually think, my parents, they have all these rules. It's so lame, and we'll have a friend that doesn't have rules. And we're like, I wish I was that guy. But as we get older, we realize our parents, and they're not perfect, but they give laws, they give rules with the intent to help care for, to help nurture, to keep safe, to build, to create good character, and to help our lives to be better. And when we see with God as he's the perfect example of that, his commands are not to be burdensome. They're not to cause issues. They're actually the reverse. They're to give life and life to the full. So when he says, when he tells the Israelites, don't be around people that are wicked, don't let them live around you, it is for their own benefit and good. And when they reject God, they reject what is good for themselves. It's just important for us to be aware of this stuff. The second thing is, not only did they not obey God by driving out the inhabitants of the land, but the other issue is that there was idolatry here. And so in chapter 2, verses 10, and I'm going to read through it quite a little bit here, but this really sets up the cycle of judges that I was talking about. And here's what it said. After that whole generation had been gathered to their fathers, another generation grew up who knew neither the Lord nor what he had done for Israel. Then the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord, and they served the Baals. The Baals are an idol. It's pagan worship. They forsook the Lord, the God of their fathers, who had brought them out of Egypt. They followed and worshipped various gods of the peoples around them. They provoked the Lord to anger because they forsook him and served Baal and the Asherahs. In his anger against Israel, the Lord handed them over to raiders who plundered them. He sold them to their enemies all around, whom they were no longer able to resist. Whenever Israel went out to fight, the hand of the Lord was against them to defeat them, just as he had sworn to them. They were in great distress. Then the Lord raised up judges who saved them out of the hands of these raiders. Yet they would not listen to their judges, but they prostituted themselves to other gods and worshipped them. Unlike their fathers, they quickly turned from the way in which their fathers had walked, the way of obedience to the Lord's command. Whenever the Lord raised up a judge for them, he was with the judge and saved them out of the hands of their enemies as long as the judge lived. For the Lord had compassion on them as they groaned under those who oppressed and afflicted them. But when the judge died, the people returned to ways even more corrupt than those of their fathers, following other gods and serving and worshiping them. They refused to give up their evil and stubborn ways. Whew. So the picture is that cycle that we had talked about earlier with Judges, that God's people rejected God and so received on themselves the consequences of their sin. And yet God in his compassion had just time and time again delivered them. The other way that Israel brought upon them judgment and brought about wickedness and caused a lot of issues was intermarrying with people that were totally pagans, people that were not ones who honored God and feared God. It says this in chapter 3, verses 5 and 6. The Israelites lived among the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. In other words, the translation is bad people. They took their daughters in marriage and gave their own daughters to their sons and served their gods. God had told them, stay apart, stay separate from those that worship idols. And instead of doing that, they intermarried with them. They became family. They willingly embraced marrying into people that were people that rejected God and people that did not serve them. And so as that goes, they basically are setting up for themselves why it is that they had failures to obey God and follow his covenant. So we come to the next division here. So the next division is going to be the course of failure is how it's written out on here. And by course of failure, what we mean is there's going to be a repetition of that pattern we talked about with different judges. So we're going to be focusing on 6 different judges. The other ones have given really short accounts. So we'll go ahead and start with that. So anyhow, so with that, the interesting thing about those 6 judges that I mentioned, there's also not just a cycle that is happening with the Israelites repeating this pattern, and you'll see it repeated, but also there's a deterioration in the judges. The first 3 major judges that are covered are, for all accounts, righteous people, good, solid, wholesome people. And then starting with the 4th, with Gideon, there starts to be some things that are introduced that you're like, he's a good dude, but he's got some issues. And then by the time it gets to the next 2 judges, there's even more and more of a moral slide going on there. So not only is there an issue with God's people, but even the people that are rescuing them, there's more and more issues from them as well. So the very first one, I want you to see this. It's in chapter 3, verses 7 to 11. So it's only 4 verses long, but this is going to let you see the cycle really, really clearly. The Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord. They forgot the Lord their God and served the Baals and Asherahs. Here's the first part of the cycle. The Israelites sin against God by following idols. The anger of the Lord burned against Israel so that he sold them into the hands of Cushan Rishathaim, king of Aram Naharaim, to whom the Israelites were subject for 8 years. Now the Israelites are oppressed and they're a conquered people and it's miserable. But when they cried out to the Lord, he raised up for them a deliverer, Othniel, son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother, who saved them. And then here we go. Here's the last part of the cycle, that God empowers a judge, raises up a leader to bring deliverance. The Spirit of the Lord came upon him so that he became Israel's judge and went to war. The Lord gave Cushan Rishathaim, king of Aram, into the hands of Othniel, who overpowered him. So the land had peace for 40 years, and Othniel, son of Kenaz, died. So there we see the cycle here. And once again, it doesn't even go a verse later than that. And what we see is this in verse 12. Once again, the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord, and because they did this evil, the Lord gave Eglon, king of Moab, power over Israel. And once again, the cycle continues here. So with Ehud, Ehud is the next judge that God raises up. And Ehud is interesting. Does some crazy secret agent, assassin, ninja work. And basically, he goes to give tribute to the king of Moab. And he's a left-handed person, which is sort of unusual, and so he makes a small kind of dagger sword, and instead of putting it on the side that you would expect as a right-handed person, he puts it on the opposite one and hides it behind his leg, and essentially assassinates the king, locks the doors, and then leaves and makes everyone think the king is just hanging out by himself, and so they don't go and interrupt the king and see that he's murdered, and he escapes in the meantime like a little ninja and runs off, leads all Israel, and they go ahead and get their freedom from Moab. There's an interesting thing in verse 19 and 26, and I just want to read it to you. In verse 19, it says this about Ehud. This is when he's going up to give the king tribute. It just says, "At the idols near Gilgal, he himself turned back and said, 'I have a secret message for you, O king.'" That's right before he kills the king. After he kills him and runs out, it says this in verse 26. While they were waiting, Ehud got away. He passed by the idols and escaped to Seirah. It's interesting because in both cases, I felt like when Judges was written, it didn't have to include all those extra details, but why did it include both times that when he went to Moab, that he had to cross and pass through idols? And I just think there's a real simple explanation, which is this is just giving an example of why it's a reminder of why Israel is in the problem that they are, that they are being conquered by people that have false gods because they have compromised on their worship of the true God. And this is basically just a reminder of that. It's a reminder of the way that Israel has pursued idolatry and disobedience to God. So after this, the land has peace for 80 years. After this, there's a judge named Shamgar. And the reason I'm going to pass him is it's one verse, is we don't get a lot of details about him. Although, I mean, he sounds like kind of like the Arnold Schwarzenegger of Israel. I mean, this guy, he strikes down 600 Philistines with an ox goad. I mean, the guy was probably so swole. But after this, we're going to come up to Deborah. Now, Deborah is a really kind of an interesting story because she is the person who is leading, she's a prophetess who's leading Israel. In verse 4 of chapter 4, it says, "Deborah, a prophetess, the wife of Lapidoth, was leading Israel at that time." So in verse 6, Israel had been oppressed because of sin and wickedness, because you know the pattern by now. They sin, they're wicked, they get conquered by a foreign enemy, they're oppressed, they need a deliverer, they cry out to God because they're like, oh man, this is horrible. And God has compassion and sends a deliverer. And here's what happens in but there's an interesting thing about this because you kind of wonder who is the judge really? Because the prophetess calls for somebody that God has appointed. So God has a plan for a judge. And here's what it says in verse 6. "She sent for Barak, son of Abinoam from Kadesh Naphtali, and said to him, 'The Lord, the God of Israel, commands you, go take with you 10,000 men of Naphtali and Zebulun and lead the way to Mount Tabor. I will lead Sisera, the commander of Jabin's army.'" That's the people that are oppressing them right now. "With his chariots and his troops to the Kishon River and give him into your hands." Amazing. So God is essentially raising up Barak to be the next judge. Here you go. And Deborah, the prophetess, says, God has told you, go and do these things. He's going to deliver the enemy into your hands. But look at Barak's response to her in verse 8. Barak said to her, "If you go with me, I will go, but if you don't go with me, I won't go." So Deborah says, "Very well, I will go with you, but because of the way you are going about this, the honor will not be yours, for the Lord will hand over Sisera to a woman." So Deborah went with Barak to Kadesh, where he summoned them. 10,000 men followed them, and Deborah also went with him. Now, at this point, you're probably thinking, okay, it's probably Deborah that God's going to turn this enemy bad general guy, Sisera, over to her. But I want to point out something that's pretty gnarly about Barak is God says, "I'm going to be with you." God says this, right? He says in verse 7, "I will lure Sisera, the commander of Jabin's army, with his chariot and his troops to the Kishon River and give them into your hands." God tells Barak, "I am going to give him into your hands." So God then is going to be fighting for him. He's going to go before him and he's going to handle this. But Barak says, I'm only going to go if Deborah goes with me. Here's what's a little wild to me. And remember when I said, like, if you read through this, you're like, oh, Barak, what a wimp. Deborah, she's so cool. But when you dig in this a little bit further, I think it shows some kind of gnarly things. It shows something about this, about what is the morality in Israel at this time. Remember that in verse 4 that Deborah was said to be leading Israel at this time. She was the person that they looked to for direction and leadership. But what's crazy about Barak is he is so disconnected from God that when God himself says, I'm going to go and deliver this for you, go and do this, he's like, no, 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 I need Deborah there. Because Barak has more faith in Deborah than in the God that Deborah's a prophetess of. That he says, I need to have her with me. God with me is not enough. And why would he say that? I think it's only possible if he didn't have any kind of relationship with God. That he was so disconnected from God and he had no fear of God in his life. And he had totally rejected trusting him and the rich stories of their ancestry of like they're in the promised land because God is great. They came out of Egypt because God is great. They survived in the desert because God is great. Total failure on his part at this time. Total failure. So what ends up happening is God, sure enough, he's totally on, like he keeps his word. Barak and all them, they just strike down this guy and all his chariots, and Sisera flees on foot, and he goes into this mighty king, this one that's the head of all these like army of chariots that's been oppressing Israel. He ends up hiding out in this tent, and while he's sleeping, a housewife, literally kills him in his sleep. And so, like Deborah had prophesied, the glory of this was not going to go to Barak because he didn't trust God, and instead went to a housewife who ended up taking care of business. Is unbelievable. It's just kind of wild, to be honest. There's a long song that Deborah sings. I'm going to spare you and not singing. To be honest, I'm better at teaching than I am at singing, so I'll just stick to that. There's a song about it, and then it says the land now has peace for 40 years. But in chapter 6, verse 1, after the period of peace, here's what we see. Again, the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord, and for 7 years he gave them into the hands of the Midianites. Let me just read to you a little description of how bad it is. Because the power of Midian was so oppressive, the Israelites prepared shelters for themselves in mountain clefts, caves, and strongholds. Whenever the Israelites planted their crops, the Midianites, Amalekites, and other eastern people invaded the country. They camped on the land and ruined the crops all the way to Gaza and did not spare a living thing for Israel, neither sheep nor cattle nor donkeys. They came up with their livestock and their tents like swarms of locusts. It was impossible to count the men and their camels. They invaded the land to ravage it. Midian so impoverished the Israelites that they cried out to the Lord for help. Think about this whole picture right now. These are God's people that are coming into the promised land promised to their forefather. But because they have disobeyed God and they've rejected the path of obedience and worship, God has let them say, you're not living under my blessing because you've rejected me. And their life is so oppressive that they're living in mountain clefts and caves and strongholds. They're living in really meager places. And they're subjected to totally being trampled on. This is the promised land. But because of their disobedience, they're not living like it's the promised land because they have rejected God. Now from there, God hears about this and he sends somebody to help them out. Enter Gideon. Here's how the angel of the Lord speaks of when he first says to him. This is chapter 6, verse 12. When the angel of the Lord appeared to Gideon, he said, "The Lord is with you, mighty warrior." Cool. God's going to send a mighty warrior to help out his people because they're getting crazy oppressed right now. And it's awful, and they're crying out because of the pain, because of the lack of food, because of how impoverished they are and how painful life is. God be with you, mighty warrior. Nice. So like what we could be thinking is like, okay, God's going to be sending somebody really incredible, right? But if you read back a couple of verses, you find this description. Before the angel says this to Gideon, here's how he finds Gideon. It says this: the angel of the Lord came and sat down under the oak in Ophrah that belonged to Joash the Abiezrite, where his son Gideon was threshing wheat in a winepress to keep it from the Midianites. And then after that he says, "The Lord is with you, mighty warrior." The picture of wheat is you're hitting wheat really hard and stuff, and usually you have a nice air circulation there, so it blows away the chaff, the part of the plant that you don't eat, and it lets the wheat fall to the ground where you can collect it. Threshing wheat in a wine press is not a good place to do it because a wine press is like usually it's dug down a little bit. And so you can imagine he's trying to hit this stuff, but he doesn't want to be seen by the oppressors because they'll come in and steal his food. So you have this guy that's terrified of being oppressed and having stuff stolen from him. So he's hiding out in this little thing like trying to hit this weed and trying to gather it just so he can have enough food to himself and hide from other people. It's kind of ironic that God says mighty warrior. Gideon's not really acting how a mighty warrior would act. A mighty warrior, I would think, would be threshing his wheat and just say, I don't care. If anyone sees me, I'll take him out. Gideon is hiding. It seems like Gideon maybe has some fear issues. It kind of seems like that. God tells him shortly after this there's a couple of things he tells him, but one of the most interesting things that he says that he needs to tear down his father's Asherah pole and his altar to Baal. Now, this is kind of crazy. Gideon is one of God's people, and in his home, right around his little area that he lives, they have an altar to Baal and an Asherah pole. These are pagan, idolatrous artifacts they use to worship other deities. Here's what God says in verse 25. That same night the Lord said to him, take the second bull from your father's herd, the one 7 years old. Tear down your father's altar to Baal and cut down the Asherah pole beside it. Then build a proper kind of altar to the Lord your God on the top of this height. Using the wood of the Asherah pole that you cut down, offer the second bull as a burnt offering to cover the sins, right? Sins of the people. Now, remember, Gideon, mighty warrior. He gathers 10 of his servants and he did as the Lord told him. But here's what it says in verse 27. But because he was afraid of his family and the men of the town, he did it at night rather than in the daytime. So he did obey God. Kudos to you, Gideon. It is hard to obey God. But he's terrified of everybody. So he's like, I'll just kind of wait till nighttime, till everyone's sleeping, and then do it really quiet. So it kind of backs up and confirms a little bit more about Gideon. There seems to be some fear issues in this guy. The mighty warrior, I mean, the angel of the Lord says it, so I don't doubt it, but kind of amazing that he does have fear issues. He is obedient though, so I guess if you and I have fear issues, we could still be mighty warriors. We could still be used by God, even in our fear, if we stay obedient to him. Sounds pretty good. Sounds like a good word to learn. So, but here's something really interesting. In verse 30 of chapter 6, here's the response when the people of his family and village, when they find out that it was him that did it, here's what they say. The men of the town demanded of Joash, bring out your son, he must die because he has broken down Baal's altar and cut down the Asherah pole beside it. Now, this is the point that I want to bring up right here. Remember, like when we read this, we're like, man, that's crazy, right? But when I said at the beginning of this time where I said, if you dig into Judges, it can get more and more disturbing. Think about who is his family? Who are the people around his town? They're Israelites. They are God's people. And what are they saying right now? Hey, one of our Israelite brothers burned up, broke down an altar to Baal, fake god, idol, and cut down an Asherah pole, and we want to kill him. We're going to kill him because he destroyed that. What is going on with God's people right now? Remember, in Deuteronomy, it makes it really clear. If there's a person in the assembly, if there's one of the children of Israel, if they make idolatrous practices, if they offer sacrifices, they're to be put to death. And here we have a sick, and I think in some ways this is like the way Satan works, is he just totally twists and distorts things. So now instead of the people being killed for sacrificing on an altar, now God's people want to kill the person that would destroy an idolatrous idol. Think about, morally speaking, just how messed up things are right now in Israel, that God's people would want to put to death one of their own because they destroyed an idol to another god. It's unbelievable. It's absolutely unbelievable. So from that, God tells them, hey, I'm going to go use you to deliver the Israelites. And Gideon has this thing where he's like, I don't know if I can trust you. So I'm going to have a way to test you. So here's what Gideon says in verse 36. Gideon said to God, if you will save Israel by my hand as you promised, look, I'll place a wool fleece on the threshing floor. If there's dew only on the fleece, but all the ground is dry, I'll know that you will save Israel by my hand, as you said. And that is what happened. Gideon rose early the next day. He squeezed the fleece and wrung out the dew, a bowl full of water. But the ground's dry. Why did Gideon do this? I think he might have fear issues. I think when God tells him to do something, he's got some fear there. And then here's what Gideon says. Yeah, God, I'll follow you. Oh, wait. You know what? Let me read the Bible. Let's see what it says. Then Gideon said to God, do not be angry with me. Let me make just one more request. Allow me one more test with the fleece. This time make the fleece dry and the ground covered with dew. That night God did so. Only the fleece was dry. All the ground was covered with dew. Because he's probably thinking, okay, well, maybe if there's a weird weather situation, or maybe there was somebody that dumped a bucket of water on the fleece. And so he asked God for another sign, a test. And God, in his graciousness, honors it. Pretty unbelievable. So God tells Gideon, go ahead, defeat the Midianites. And he starts off with an army of 32,000. And God says, nah, you know what? That's too many men. Too many men. If you go into battle with 32,000, people are going to say, look at us. We're powerful. We did it. And God said, I want to make it known to Israel that I'm the one who's delivering you. So you can excuse anyone that's scared. And they dropped down to 10,000 people. And then God said, you know what? 10,000 is too many men. It's too many men. So he has them go and drink water, and everyone that drinks water and laps up like a dog, he says that person will go. And so they go from 32,000 to 10,000 to 300. 300. I'm thinking if Gideon had fear problems before, he's probably thinking, I had 32,000 people in my army, and now I have 300. But Gideon obeys God. And they go up to the camp at night. They put fire in their clay pots, and they have trumpets, and they smash the jars, and there's lights, and there's trumpets, and there's noise. And then God basically makes the entire army, the entire enemy army, freak out and turn themselves, and they essentially kill each other. They kill the vast number, and then he chases after them. There's a short account after that where he chases down some people that aren't helping him, and then Gideon comes to kind of like the end of his life, but there's basically a bummer thing that happens. All Israel asks him, and this is in chapter 8, verse 22, the Israelites said to Gideon, rule over us, you, your son, and your grandson, because you've saved us from the hand of Midian. And here's what Gideon says, I will not rule over you, nor will my son rule over you. Remember that one there. The Lord will rule over you. Yeah, I love this. He's saying, let's let God be our ruler. Let's let God, and this isn't in opposition to what Barak did, because Barak was like, no, Deborah's going to be my leader. But here, Gideon is saying, let God be your ruler. Don't put a man up to be the ruler. Let God be the one who rules us. But he does say this, I do have one request, that each of you would give me an earring from your share of the plunder. And then with it, he makes a gold ephod, which is basically like a priestly garment that was used in worship. But here's the unfortunate thing about this gift that he makes. In verse 27, it says, Gideon made the gold into an ephod, which he placed in Ophrah, his town. All Israel prostituted themselves by worshiping it there, and it became a snare to Gideon and his family. It's so sad. And this is, and right after this is where we see that Gideon dies. Now, what's insane is that, remember at the very beginning of this, right in his home, there was these Baal and Asherah poles. There's idolatry there, and he cuts them down. He goes and does this work for God. God delivers his people. He says, yeah, God, you're going to be the leader. And then he makes this gold ephod, which ends up leading people to idolatrous worship. It's so sad. It's like you're just setting up the next stage of the problem here by creating this article that was going to lead people away from the worship of the true God. So after that, Gideon dies, and we find out that he has 70 sons. And one of his sons leads up a rebellion, and he has all of his brothers put to death. One escapes, but he has them all put to death in one spot. It's just horrific. And this one son is like, I'm going to become the new king. And there's a curse put on him and by the one brother that escapes. And then God honors that curse. And so the brother Abimelech ends up having issues with the people that he is the king over, and they fight back and forth, and they end up essentially doing a lot of destruction and destroying each other, and then he dies. It's it's just kind of crazy, to be honest. It shows a lot of just the madness of when God's people just reject God and reject following Him and just do their own thing, and the wickedness and the devastation that comes from that. In chapter 10, there's two small accounts of different judges, Tola and Jair, and then it comes to Jephthah. Now, Jephthah is kind of an interesting guy. Like, he's kind of wild, kind of a reckless adventurer. He's kind of rash and makes kind of gnarly decisions. He's the son of a warrior, but his mom was a prostitute. And because he was illegitimate, he was basically cast out of his family and cast out of the group. But when things started getting bad, when the Ammonites were taking over, a bunch of elders came up to him. They're like, hey, can you come and help us? And he's like, wait a minute. And then verse 7, and here's what Jephthah says to them. He says, didn't you hate me and drive me from my father's house? Why do you come to me now when you're in trouble? The elders of Gilead said to him, no, nevertheless, we're turning to you now. Come with us to fight the Ammonites, and you will be our head over all who live in Gilead. So Jephthah then goes to fight for them, and there's a pretty crazy battle, and he has victory. But here's the crazy thing. It says in verse 29, the Spirit of the Lord came upon Jephthah. He crossed Gilead and Manasseh, passed through Mizpah of Gilead, and from there he advanced against the Ammonites. Remember how I said Jephthah seems like he's kind of not an adventurer, but he's kind of rash and reckless. And this is one of the biggest ways it plays out. Jephthah made a vow to the Lord, if you give the Ammonites into my hands, whatever comes out of the door of my house to meet me when I return in triumph from the Ammonites will be the Lord's, and I will sacrifice it as a burnt offering. And here's where I think, what? Because the only thing that comes out of doorways are living things, right? So he's essentially saying, I'm going to sacrifice a burnt offering of some living thing that comes out of my doorway. And for me, I'm like, why are you doing this, Jephthah? Like, the Spirit of God has already come upon you. Why did you make this vow? God didn't say make a vow. God didn't require this of you. You just determined that you were going to do this. So Jephthah goes to fight the Ammonites, and God just delivers, and he just devastates town after town after town, and the land becomes free. So when he returns to his home, in verse 34, it says this, who should come out to meet him but his daughter, dancing to the sound of tambourines? She was an only child. Except for her, he had neither son nor daughter. When he saw her, he tore his clothes and cried, oh, my daughter, you have made me miserable and wretched because I have made a vow to the Lord I cannot break. And her response, I remember when I first read this when I was younger, like as a kid, I was like, this is horrible. She says, my father, you've given your word to the Lord. Do to me just as you promised, now that the Lord has avenged you of your enemies, the Ammonites. But grant me this one request. Give me 2 months to roam the hills and weep with my friends, because I will never marry. She goes and does that, and he keeps his word. This is horrible stuff. This is horrific stuff. They make a point of saying in here that it's especially wretched for Jephthah because not only is it his daughter, and she seems to be an incredible girl, she seems awesome, it's that she's an only child. He has no other offspring right now, and she's unmarried, which means he has no heir. He has no descendant that will carry on his name or carry on his legacy that he can pass on to. It's just horrible. It's absolutely just so sad what happens here out of this rash promise that he makes to God. Oh man, I can't even believe it. The next thing that happens is that there's a whole argument between Jephthah, the forces of Gilead, and another tribe of Israel, the Ephraimites. And because of this entire disagreement, argument, fight, name calling, all this stuff, it ends up being that 42,000 die from intertribal warfare. So even though he delivers the people, because there's an issue and a problem, instead of having diplomacy, instead of working it out, instead of drawing people together, he causes more fights to happen that break out and kill a lot of people. Tens of thousands of Israelites die here, which is like, whoa, man, like you could have probably tried to work things out. You could have probably tried to handle these things in a better way, but instead it led to the death of a lot of clansmen. In some ways, Judges to me feels sort of like the Wild West. It's just, whoa, everyone is just kind of doing what they please. Everyone's going for whatever they feel like doing. It's pretty gnarly. And so now we're going to go ahead and come to the last major judge that we're going to examine today, which is Samson. Samson is also probably the most famous of the judges. We have, Samson has long hair, Samson and Delilah, Samson really buff, beating up people with the jawbone of a donkey. Um, and it's kind of a crazy trajectory that Samson goes on. Once again, we see the beginning of the cycle in Judges chapter 13, verse 1. Again, the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord. So the Lord delivered them into the hands of the Philistines for 40 years. And here's what ends up happening. I want to read the next section here. A certain man of Zorah named Manoah from the clan of the Danites had a wife who was sterile and remained childless. So she was barren. She had no kids. The angel of the Lord appeared to her and said, "You are sterile and childless, but you are going to conceive and have a son. Now see to it that you drink no wine or other fermented drink, and that you do not eat anything unclean. Because you will conceive and give birth to a son. No razor may be used on his head, because the boy is to be a Nazirite, set apart to God from birth, and he will begin the deliverance of Israel from the hands of the Philistines." Pretty incredible. So what we hear is there's a baby boy born to a barren woman, someone who'd never had kids before, but God enables her to have a child, and then this child is going to grow up and then be set apart for God's service, a Nazirite is the term there. So he's now set apart for it. The people of Israel, they are under Philistine oppression. And when this boy named Samson, when he grows up, it says this, that he went down, this is in chapter 14, Samson went down to Timnah and saw there a young Philistine woman. When he returned, he said to his father and mother, "I've seen a Philistine woman in Timnah. Now get her for me as my wife." His father and mother replied, "Isn't there an acceptable woman among your relatives or among all our people? Must you go to the uncircumcised Philistines to get a wife?" His parents are like, "You're set apart for God. You can't go get a wife that's from a pagan culture. What are you doing?" But Samson said to his father, "Get her for me. She's the right one for me." A young man that has all the wisdom in the world about what he knows is best. But here's what's interesting. In verse 4, there's an extra comment. It says, "His parents did not know this was from the Lord, who was seeking an occasion to confront the Philistines, for at that time they were ruling over Israel." So actually, God allowed the wrong, improper, sinful request of Samson to be used for his own purposes, to bring issues between the Philistines and him. So Samson basically ends up walking along, and as he's walking along, he sees this. This is chapter 14, verse 8. It said, "Sometime later, when he went back to marry her, he turned aside to look at a lion's carcass. In it was a swarm of bees and some honey, which he scooped out with his hands and ate as he went along. When he rejoined his parents, he gave them some and they too ate it, but he did not tell them that he had taken the honey from the lion's carcass." Now, when I first read that as a young kid, I always thought it was because, if you got honey growing out of a dead lion, it's just not very hygienic, And so I always just figured that was it. But there's so much more to it, because to go near a dead body was considered unclean, and it would make you unclean. To eat something, even honey, that's right attached to this dead carcass, would be unclean. Remember the words that had been given to his mother, Samson's mother, in chapter 13, verse 4. "Now see to it that you drink no wine or other fermented drink, and that you do not eat anything unclean." Samson is a Nazirite. He is supposed to keep himself clean and avoid unclean. He doesn't tell his parents. He doesn't want them to know. He just wants the honey. Tastes good. So because of this, he has this whole riddle that he does to a bunch of guys that are attached to the bridegrooms that are attached to this wedding party, and has this whole riddle breakdown. And then, long story short, ends up not getting to marry the girl. She marries somebody else. And out of anger, Samson then basically leads to burning down a whole bunch of Philistine fields because of this. So from that, we see that he doesn't get the marriage he wants. He causes vengeance on the Philistines. And then because of that, there's a whole bunch of Philistines that they say, "Hey, listen, the Israelites, you need to give up Samson or we are going to kill you all." So they're like, "Ugh." So they basically tie up Samson, give him to the Philistines. But then when, and let me read this to you in verse 14. "As he approached Lehi, the Philistines came toward him shouting. The Spirit of the Lord came upon him on power, The ropes on his arms became like charred flax, and the bindings dropped from his hands. Finding a fresh jawbone of a donkey, he grabbed it and struck down 1,000 men. Dang, that's crazy. I mean, that's an epic fight scene right there. So Samson, then God's power comes on him and he just strikes down all of these Philistines. Pretty unbelievable and crazy. And you would think, okay, here's a guy who's set apart for God. He's not really living super great. But even though he made a bad request, he at least didn't marry somebody who was a Philistine. So, and then God used him. So maybe he's going to start making good choices, right? So in chapter 16, verse 1, it says this. One day Samson went to Gaza where he saw a prostitute. He went in to spend the night with her. Dang it, Samson, what are you doing? So not only is he with a prostitute, but he's in Gaza. This is a fortified city that's Philistine. So not only is he going to be immoral and have an immoral sexual relationship with a prostitute, it's also going to be a prostitute from an idolatrous, wicked people. It's like, this is really bad, but now you're making it extra really bad. They surround the people of the Philistines, the people of Gaza surround him, and they're going to kill him in the morning. But Samson wakes up in the middle of the night, walks out, tears these massive gates off of the hinges, and carries them and sticks them into a nearby hillside. It's crazy. The guy is so stinking strong. So you're like, oh my gosh, Samson is starting to. There's some stuff that we're starting to see about Samson, is that he's willing to compromise on being clean or unclean. He's willing to compromise on clean or unclean with food. He's willing to compromise clean or unclean with marriage. He's willing to do compromise clean or unclean with a prostitute. Not good. Not good. He's making some poor choices. Then he falls in love with someone named Delilah. Now, Delilah is being pressured by people. Hey, find out the secrets of Samson's strength. The Philistines want to destroy Samson, but he's so stinking strong. God has given him so much power, they cannot defeat him. So they're like, hey, Delilah, find out the secret of his strength. And she's not even coy about it. She's just like, tell me the secret of your strength. And he lies about it. Oh, if you do this, that'll work. She tries it, doesn't work. She comes up again. If you really loved me, you'd tell me. Okay, it's this, says Samson. She tries it, it doesn't work. Well, you deceived me. Okay, says Samson, it's this, doesn't work. Finally, she just nags him and nags him and nags him and nags him. And Samson finally tells her the truth. I'm a Nazirite. If I have the hair, my hair has never been cut. And if it gets cut, then I'll be as weak as any other man. And while he's sleeping, she gets his hair, buzzes his head, and all of his strength leaves him. And so here's what ends up happening now to Samson. In chapter 16, verse 21, it says this. Then the Philistines seized him, they gouged out his eyes, and they took him down to Gaza. Binding him with bronze shackles, they set him to grinding in the prison. So Samson, because of his falling in love with and being led astray by a wicked Philistine woman, gives up the secret of his strength, and as a result, loses his strength and is blinded. His eyes are knocked out. It's just horrific. The Philistines, the rulers, have this huge celebration to their god named Dagon. And they're like, hey, bring out Samson. We want to laugh at this blind guy. We're going to just make fun of him. And they put his hand on two pillars. His hair had started to come back, and Samson prays this. In verse 28, Samson prayed to the Lord, O sovereign Lord, remember me. O God, please strengthen me just once more, and let me with one blow get revenge on the Philistines for my two eyes. Then Samson reached toward the two central pillars on which the temple stood. Bracing himself against them, his right hand on the one and his left hand on the other, Samson said, let me die with the Philistines. Then he pushed with all his might, and down came the temple on the rulers and all the people on it. Thus he killed many people when he died than while he lived. Crazy. If you look at Samson, you say like, okay, he delivered Israel and that's good. He helped out Israel, that's good. But there was a lot of compromise and a lot of just mistakes and letdowns. And the crazy thing is, if you look at Samson and you compare him a little bit to the rest of the Israelites, you can honestly see that Israel's progression kind of follows him. Here's what I mean. Like, Samson is born to a barren woman, a woman who had never had children, but God said, you're going to have a child. Very similar to the beginning of Israel with Abraham, the promise coming to Abraham and his wife Sarah, and God saying in their old age, you will have a child. And then out of that, when you look at Samson, God says, you're going to be set apart for me. And God, for Abraham, has set him and all of his descendants apart for himself. There's a setting apart. You're a special part to me. You have a special role to play. You have a special relationship to me. Don't let unclean things touch your lips. But Samson was willing to compromise with honey, with foreigners, with prostitutes. And you see with Israel that Israel themselves disobeyed God, whether it was people like Achan when Joshua went into the battle of Ai and he had stolen, instead of leaving the gold and silver for God and his temple, he stole it from Jericho. There's disobedience. There's the mixing in of other religions and the intermarriage with other foreign people, just like you see happen with Israel. Same with Samson. And you just see that because he has rejected God, that God's protection withdraws from him and he suffers for it horrifically. And the people of Israel have the same thing. How many times do the Israelites fall into sin, fall into oppression because they disobeyed God and they walked away from God? The life is so difficult and painful. And sometimes I wonder, how many times, Tim? How many times are you going to walk away from God? How many times are you going to forget him? How many times are you going to compromise? And I ask you as you're listening to this, how many times have you willfully walked away from God and brought on yourself the consequences and the pain and the difficulty of being separate from him? It doesn't have to be that way for me. It doesn't have to be that way for you. God's compassion is great, yes. Samson is used by God, but my goodness, how much better would it have been for his life and the people of Israel if he had lived rightly with God. Now, as we come into Judges now, what we're going to do is we're actually coming into the final section of the book of Judges. So we've kind of completed a lot of the cyclical stuff with the different judges that take place. And now what we're looking at is, now that we've seen all this failure and all these things, there's two major stories we're going to see. So let me go ahead. We're going to pull up the little slide here real fast. So when you look at this slide, you can see that we've kind of been through all the different judges and what they've been through. And now we're going to look at two major stories. It's called Curses from Failure. And this is what we're going to come to right now. So the first one is Judges chapter 17. And what we see is that there's a guy named Micah. And Micah and his mom, they have a bunch of silver. And here's what they say in chapter 17, verse 3. When he returned the 1,100 shekels of silver to his mother, she said, I solemnly consecrate my silver to the Lord for my son to make a carved image and a cast idol. What? What? This is an Israelite, and she's saying, I will consecrate my silver to the Lord so my son can make an idol. Oh my gosh, hopefully this gives an idea like what is happening in Israel. I'm going to dedicate this gold to God when his number one commandment is, I'm the Lord your God, you shall have no other gods before me. Here's silver for you, God, I'm dedicating it to you so I can make an idol with it. What is happening? There's a mixing, a blending of religions, and they are just so lost in the wickedness and rebellion in this. Oh my gosh, it's just so crazy when you see that. And it's really summed up in Judges chapter 17, verse 6. It said, in those days, Israel had no king. Everyone did as he saw fit. It's a phrase that comes out multiple times in the book of Judges. And that really sums it up. Everyone did as he saw fit. This is like madness. There's a young Levite that travels by, and the guy that is making this idol says, hey, I'm going to hire you to be my priest. And I'll give you money, and you can stay here, and you'll be my priest and work with these idols and stuff, and that'll be good. And the Levite's like, okay, that sounds good. I'll do it. And in verse 13, Micah said, now I know the Lord will be good to me since this Levite has become my priest. It's so mixed up. It's so twisted. So then the Danites, they're going through this area. They're exploring it. And while they're exploring it, because they're trying to figure out where there is that they're going to have for their own place, as they're scouting out the land, they run into Micah's house, and they're like, oh, there's a bunch of idols here and a Levite. So they ask the Levite, can you tell us if we're going to be successful? And the Levite's like, let me inquire of God. Yep, you're going to do it. So later on, they come back and they're like, hey, listen, why don't you, Mr. Levite, come with us? Because instead of helping out one household, you can be the priest for our entire tribe. And the Levite's like, sure enough, sounds great. He grabs all the idols, they go with him. And as they're leaving, Micah finds out and he says, wait, come back here. That's my idol. That's my Levite. They're mine. And the Danites are like, don't argue with us or somebody who has a big attitude will come in there and kill you. Just let us be. And so they go there, and so the Danites leave and they come to their own land. And here's what's really sad about what they say. It says this in chapter 18, verse 30 to 31. There the Danites set up for themselves the idols, and Jonathan, son of Gershom, the son of Moses, and his sons were priests for the tribe of Dan until the time of the captivity of the land. They continued to use the idols Micah had made all the time the house of God was in Shiloh. Man, so this mom dedicates money to God to make an idol. A guy hires a Levite. It gets stolen by a tribe, and then the tribe sets up idol worship in the nation of Israel, in God's people. Unbelievable. The sad thing is that's not even the worst story. The second story that we're going to go to now is like a million times nastier than that. It's horrible. It involves a concubine, and I'll just give a quick explanation. A concubine. So if there was a rich man and he felt like, oh, I don't have a male heir, he would take on a secondary wife who would then become somebody that could basically like ensure I'm going to have enough kids. So what we see is that in this case, we find out in Judges chapter 19, it says, a Levite who lived in a remote area in the hill country of Ephraim took a concubine from Bethlehem in Judah, but she was unfaithful to him. She left him and went back to her father's house in Bethlehem, Judah. So here's how we understand this. There's a Levite. He wants to make sure he has enough kids and takes on a second wife, a concubine, but she's unfaithful to him. And the picture is that she's immoral sexually. So she is unfaithful, and then she takes off and goes back to her father's house. After she had been there 4 months, her husband went to her to persuade her to return. He had with him his servant and 2 donkeys. Now, there's a whole bunch of a rigmarole here that goes on, and because this is a survey, I'm not going to get caught into that, but basically, it seems like this Levite is well-to-do because he can afford a servant, donkeys, and he can afford a concubine. And so he goes back to his unfaithful concubine to bring her back with him. After a bit of like going back and forth over several days, he finally leaves, but he leaves later in the day than he wanted to. As he's going along, they're like, hey, let's stop in this town over here. And he's like, no. I am not going to stop in an alien city where people aren't Israelites. I'm going to an Israelite city. So they travel on through the night, and they stop at an Israelite town. While he stops there, they're waiting in the middle of the town, and nobody offers them a place to stay. They're just kind of chilling there. And an old man sees them and says, what are you guys doing here? And he basically says, oh, I'm traveling from here to there. And then he said this. He said, we have both straw and fodder for our donkeys and bread and wine for ourselves. We don't need anything. And so the old man is like, well, no problem. Come into my house. And then this is where I feel like things just start getting worse, right? Now, it feels bad to me already that you have a Levite who is a person of God, and Levites are instructed that their inheritance is God. God is their inheritance. And instead of being good with his one wife, he takes on a concubine. It seems not so good, right? But nothing too crazy has happened yet. And so here's what ends up happening here. While they are in there, it says this in chapter 19, verse 22. While they were enjoying themselves, some of the wicked men of the city surrounded the house. Pounding on the door, they shouted to the old man who owned the house, bring out the man who came to your house so we can have sex with him. The owner of the house went outside and said to them, no, my friends, don't be so vile. Since this man is my guest, don't do this disgraceful thing. Let's just pause it right there. This is horrific. This is disgusting. This is Sodom and Gomorrah levels of just total, just disgusting, this wickedness at such a high level. There are so many different things being violated in this, let alone a same-sex act, which is considered not just unclean, but horrific and worthy of death among God's people, but also that you have a person who is a visitor and a guest of someone's home. And instead of offering them and caring for them, as you could see in a lot of like Leviticus, there was concern and care for other people and helping out others. Like there's none of that in this. So God's people, and remember, the Levite said, I need to go to God, like to Israelites. I'm not going to go to a place where there's not Israelites. And these are the Israelites. Absolutely horrific. And so my thinking is, oh, the old man is sticking up for him. And now this is the part where the old man pulls out a sword and they just get into the fight scene. It gets worse. Look, here is my virgin daughter and his concubine. I'll bring them out to you now, and you can use them and do to them whatever you wish. But to this man, don't do such a disgraceful thing. But the men would not listen to him. What? Okay, so wicked people outside, and then the old man says, well, listen, listen, listen. You can have my virgin daughter and his concubine and do with them whatever you want. Just don't do anything to him. I was like, oh, the old man I thought was a good guy. What is he doing now? And so here's what ends up happening. The man took his concubine and sent her outside of them. In this case, a concubine was a second-class citizen. I don't know if we would say that they're a slave, but we would definitely say that they are below, like as a concubine, they're like a lower level of status. So the man took his concubine, sent her outside of them, and they raped her and abused her throughout the night. And at dawn, they let her go. At daybreak, the woman went back to the house where her master was staying, fell down at the door, and lay there until daylight. When her master got up in the morning and opened the door of the house and stepped out to continue on his way, there lay his concubine fallen in the doorway of the house with her hands on the threshold. Okay, this is horrific. This is disgusting. So you're thinking, surely this guy is going to say, like, maybe he's going to help her out, bandage her, whatever. And here's what he does. He said to her, get up, let's go. But there's no answer. What on earth is happening here? It just gets worse. Probably because the whole reason this guy went to get his concubine in the first place was because she was unfaithful to him. So perhaps by the time all this is going down and he's getting threatened with being sexually abused himself, he's probably thinking, okay, I'll send her out because she already was unfaithful to me, so I don't really care what happens to her. All night long, they send her out, and she comes back. She lays down there. It says the man put her on the donkey and set off for home. So she's dead. Get up, let's go. Unbelievable. This whole thing is horrific, but it gets worse. When he reached home, he took a knife and he cut up his concubine limb by limb into 12 parts and sent them into all the areas of Israel. Everyone who saw it said, such a thing has never been seen or done, not since the day the Israelites came up out of Egypt. Think about it, consider it, tell us what to do. Oh my gosh, this is the gnarliest story ever. It says, then all the Israelites from Dan to Beersheba and from the land of Gilead came out as one man and assembled before the Lord in Mizpah. The leaders of all the people, the tribes of Israel, took their places in the assembly of the people of God, 400,000 soldiers armed with swords. The Israelites said, tell us how this awful thing happened. So the Levite goes and tells them all that happens. And then all the people go against them, mobilize them, and kill a whole bunch of the people that were responsible for this. It's crazy. It's like this whole story just gets worse and worse and worse and worse and worse. There are so many people from the tribe of Benjamin that end up getting killed in this battle. And it's just, oh my gosh. It says in chapter 20, verse 35, the Lord defeated Benjamin before Israel, and on that day the Israelites struck down 25,100 Benjaminites, all armed with swords. It is so crazy. So crazy. And then in chapter 21, the men of Israel had taken an oath at Mizpah, saying, not one of us will give his daughter in marriage to the Benjaminites. But then they realized a problem. One of the tribes of Israel did wrong. They came out in open warfare against them, killed 25,100 of their own kinsmen. And then they realized, we're not going to give any of our daughters to them in marriage. But they also ended up killing all of their wives off too. It's so insane. And so because of that, they're like, oh no, the Benjaminites are gonna die off now. And so they find oh gosh, it's crazy. There's women who are spared from destruction that they send, like, okay, you can have these. And then they're like, that's not enough wives. What are we gonna do? And then they're like, oh, well, what we're going to do is there's going to be an annual festival of the Lord in Shiloh. This is in chapter 21, verse 19, to the north of Bethel, east of the road. And they instructed the Benjamites, saying, go in the vineyards and watch. When the girls of Shiloh come out to join in the dancing, rush from the vineyards, and each of you seize a wife from the girls of Shiloh and go to the land of Benjamin. When their fathers or brothers complain, we'll say, do us a kindness by helping them, because we did not get wives for them during the war, and you are innocent since you did not give your daughters to them. So that's what they did. They went to where there was a festival of the Lord. A whole bunch of young girls run around, and the Benjamites grab them and take them back to their house, rip them out of their homes and their lives, and they're like, you'll be my wife now. And then the good news is they're saying, oh, because you didn't let your daughters get married to them, you're not breaking the oath that we had. It's crazy. It is so crazy. And that's why when we come to the end of Judges, the very last verse sums it up. In those days, Israel had no king. Everyone did as he saw fit. Judges, when you read through Judges, the picture is that Israel is a mess right now. They're in a mess because they disobeyed God. They didn't get rid of the people of the land. They fell into idolatry and wickedness and immorality, and they didn't obey what God said. And as a result, they're in total chaos right now. They're screwed up with what's right and what's wrong. There's violence and bloodshed. There's division among people. It's horrible. It's absolutely horrible. And in Israel, there's no king. Everyone did as he saw fit. This never was God's plan. This was never his intention. Here's what, from the Gordon Fee and Douglas Stewart's book, called How to Read the Bible Book by Book. Here's their little sentence summation. The tragic pattern in Judges points to the next phase of God's great story of redemption, which will begin to move forward considerably through the stories of Ruth and of her great-grandson David, which is what we'll be picking up very shortly. Judges is a gnarly book. It is a horrific book. And I think in many ways it serves as a warning sign of when you reject God. When you say, nah, God, I'm good. I don't need you in my life. I don't need you in my country or among my people. Let's not have God at all. It is a picture of just the mass anarchy and chaos that comes and wickedness that comes. People that are innocent are destroyed, and it's just horrific. But what we definitely see in Judges is that while some of the judges are really good, a lot of them, they have some serious character flaws, which really points us to the hero of Judges being God. That God, as we look at the story of what God is doing among his people, is that he's a compassionate God. He's a gracious God. He's a good God, even when his people are not good. And that, to me, gives me so much hope. So it's why our church is calling out for prayer in this time, is because we think our nation needs God, our world needs God. And so as a brother in Christ talking to you today, I encourage you, double down on your prayer time. Increase the time you talk to God. When you are worried, when you're fearful, when you're concerned, use that as a reminder to pray that God's kingdom would come and his will would be done on earth as it is in heaven. So we don't fall into these horrific times. I think that there's a lot of division in our nation. I think there's a lot of chaos, a lot of moral confusion, a lot of manipulation and lying, a lot of rejection of God, and we just need more of him in it. So I just hope that this study in Judges was helpful and hopefully encouraging to you, to let you know we serve a good God, and also that we as people want to always fight to bring God into our lives and into the lives of the world around us. You guys have a great week, and we'll talk to you then. Goodbye.